Each summer since the late 1960s, hundreds of eager workers have entered the region once known as Palestine to participate in modern archaeological projects. Drawn by powerful and complex sets of religious, scientific, and personal motives, these modern pilgrims to the Holy Land stand directly in line with a succession of earlier explorers and scientists which can be traced back for more than 200 years. The earliest of these explorers were as much adventurers as they were scientists. Nevertheless, the accounts of the cultures they saw, the ancient ruins they encountered, and the natural history of the lands through which they passed were received with enthusiasm by scholars and the general public alike. Among the first of these explorers was Carsten Niebuhr, sole survivor of the Danish expedition to Arabia. Financed by the King of Denmark to provide Western maps for many of the uncharted parts of Egypt, Palestine, South Arabia, and the Persian Gulf, the expedition had hoped to return to their patron with a wealth of astronomical, meteorological, and cultural information, along with specimens of the local flora and fauna. Also notable among these early travelers was Johann Burckhardt, who first introduced Westerners to the magnificent carved rock temples of Petra. James Silk Buckingham related his adventures in a series of popular accounts, and Ulrich Seetzen described many of the striking features of the region's landscape, including the monumental ruins of Jerash. The vivid narrative depictions, maps, and graphic images produced by these intrepid explorers began to provide Westerners with a concrete sense of place for the biblical stories with which they had been nourished since birth. With these sources of information, biblical scholars were quick to recognize that many of the region's Arabic place names contained Latin, Greek, or Hebrew roots which could be correlated with names and events reported in the biblical accounts. It was this discovery which was to provide the impetus for the first systematic and scientific study of Palestine's archaeological record. The person most responsible for developing this insight into a program of rigorous investigation was the American theologian Edward Robinson. Deeply influenced by the geographers Alexander von Humboldt and Carl Ritter, Robinson drew together the disparate and singular sets of observations made by his predecessors into a coherent and unified matrix of assumptions, methods, and goals, creating the first of the great paradigms within which archaeological research in Palestine would be conducted. In 1838, Robinson and his companion Eli Smith traveled extensively in southern Palestine and the Sinai. Using information provided by the local residents, they recorded the Arabic names for the numerous topographic features and villages they visited. In addition to these contemporary and natural elements of the landscape, they also recorded the names given to the many abandoned ruins or kirbits and the small mounds called tells which dotted the Palestinian landscape. After the completion of his first tour of Palestine, Robinson suggested over 160 new biblical site identifications, dramatically enhancing a sense of place for the biblical events. By uniting philological analysis with accurate surveying techniques, Robinson and his followers provided a systematic process for the identification of many elements of the biblical landscape. After Robinson, the identification of biblical towns and cities was no longer determined by uncritical tradition or flights of individual fantasy. Site identifications were to be made on the basis of detailed observations and carefully reasoned arguments. Alternative reconstructions of the biblical landscape could now be evaluated by the systematic application of agreed-upon principles. Such work was to become the province of trained specialists, and direct participation in this stage of the archaeological enterprise was limited to persons intimately familiar with the biblical text, fluent in ancient Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, as well as modern Arabic, and well acquainted with surveying and drafting techniques. A constitution strong enough to withstand the rigors of months of travel within the Middle East was also essential. Although effectively barred from direct involvement, the general public could participate in this effort by providing financial support to the specialist. In return, the general public could expect the specialist to present lectures and to publish the results of their investigations in a form which non-specialists could appreciate. The public display of artifacts from the Holy Land was a particularly welcome bonus. During the second half of the 19th century, there was a steady influx of researchers into Palestine. Some of these, like Honoré Victor Guérin, Ernest Renan, and Titus Tobler, continued the process of locating and identifying individual sites. Others, such as William Lynch and Carol Wilhelm Meredith Vandevelde, set themselves to the arduous task of providing accurate maps of the region. Still others returned from Palestine with detailed images on woodcuts, lithographs, and even photographs. Lithographs made by William H. Bartlett and David Roberts were enormously popular in England and America, and were greatly influential in shaping the way in which Palestine came to be conceptualized by Western Judeo-Christendom. Another, less numerous group of investigators is exemplified by William McClure Thompson, a Christian missionary who traveled extensively throughout Syria and Palestine from 1832 to 1876. While he shared with others the interest in the identification of biblical sites, Thompson's primary concern was to document the many cultural traditions he encountered. Thompson reasoned that if the landscape had remained essentially unaltered from that known in biblical times, the culture and lifeways of 19th century Palestine might also closely reflect that depicted in the biblical narratives. Thus, when he saw gleaners in the field near Ramlah, watched potters at work in Jaffa, or encountered oil sellers in Jerusalem, he drew parallels between these contemporary activities and those described in the Bible. Thompson recorded his observations in a popular format in a volume titled The Land and the Book, which was reissued in several editions and became one of the most popular books of the 19th century. During the next generation, Robinson's followers rapidly expanded the program of investigation he had begun. Not only did the increasing stream of new site locations aid in the reconstruction of the biblical landscape, the growing familiarity with contemporary Palestinian lifeways began to provide a cultural context within which to interpret many of the biblical stories, customs, and laws. The success of Robinson and his followers, and the popular support their findings achieved, encouraged the development of organized societies, chartered specifically to support even more ambitious projects. The Jerusalem Water Relief Society, formed in London during 1864, commissioned a detailed topographic map of Jerusalem, a task which was carried out by the Royal Engineers under the direction of Captain Charles Wilson. In the course of this effort, Wilson succeeded in mapping Jerusalem's ancient subterranean water passages, an achievement which provided Westerners with their first detailed information about the ancient topography and construction of this most important site. Of the many organizations established during this period to support research in the Holy Land, perhaps the most important was the Palestine Exploration Fund. Formally chartered in England during the summer of 1865, the Palestine Exploration Fund's stated goal was to support investigations into the archaeology, geography, geology, and natural history of Palestine. Over the next half-century, the Palestine Exploration Fund provided support and direction for a number of the most important investigations in Palestine. Arguably, however, its most significant contribution was a survey of Western Palestine undertaken in the 1870s. Directed primarily by Claude Conder and Herbert Kitchener, this major survey project succeeded in establishing a measured baseline across Palestine and creating a precisely triangulated map of the region. The map was produced at a scale of 1 inch to the mile, and it recorded all observed towns, villages, ruins, and physical features of Palestine west of the Jordan River from Dan to Beersheba. No similar project had ever been undertaken in Palestine, and no previous work came close to matching its accuracy. It succeeded in providing the necessary framework for the systematic recording and interpretation of the increasing stream of information which was now flowing from Palestine. Information derived not only from surface survey and philological analysis, but increasingly from excavation. While not an important activity until the close of the century, the excavation of ancient sites, an activity oriented primarily toward the recovery of lost treasures, began as early as 1814 with Lady Hester Stanhope's attempt to discover a golden treasure which was reportedly buried under a Roman temple at the site of Ascalon. The Phoenician projects of Renan, conducted with the aid of the French army, were likewise directed primarily toward the recovery of valuable museum-quality artifacts. The excavations at the Tomb of the Kings in Jerusalem by Louis Félicien Cagnard de Sausset in 1851 and 1863 were also intended to find biblical period antiquities. In this case, however, the recovery of such materials was not only an end in itself, but a means to validate the claim that the Tomb of the Kings was, in fact, a tomb of the kings of Judah. While such early efforts did much to strengthen the belief that excavation could be useful to recover biblical antiquities, it was a work of Charles Warren which was to provide the most spectacular results. Sponsored primarily by the Palestine Exploration Fund, Warren's excavations in Jerusalem were undertaken in the mid-1860s. Designed not simply to recover biblical antiquities for public display, the project's primary goal was to establish the precise location of the Israelite temple and the city's ancient wall system. The news of Warren's discoveries spread by the newspapers of Europe, England, and America excited public imagination across 2 continents, even though almost none of the artifacts recovered could be associated with particular periods of the city's more than 3,000-year history. Warren's simultaneous work at Tel Sutan, the site of ancient Jericho, met with far less success. Here Warren could make no sense of the layers of mud brick walls he encountered, and in the end concluded that the site was probably the foundations of an ancient castle. At the close of the 19th century, the contributions made by the many highly talented individuals whose survey projects, philological analysis, ethnographic documentation, and, to a lesser extent, excavation efforts, had become integral parts of the research conducted within the Robinson paradigm, were drawn together into a single, integrated study with the publication of George Adam Smith's Historical Geography of the Holy Land in the year 1894. In his introduction to this enormously popular work, Smith provided what may be viewed as the classic summary of the principal motivation and aim of his contemporaries and predecessors when he wrote, "There are many ways of writing a geography of Palestine. What is needed by the reader or teacher of the Bible is some idea of the main outlines of Palestine, its shape and disposition, its plains, passes, and mountains, its rains, winds, and temperatures, its colors, lights, and shades. Students of the Bible desire to see a background and to feel an atmosphere. With the publication of this work, still in print almost a century after it first appeared, the Robinson paradigm reached the limits of its interpretive power. Limits imposed primarily by the paradigm's conception of the archaeological record as a scatter of essentially atemporal sites across a culturally empty and static landscape. This view of the archaeological record was encouraged by the general lack of chronological information. Relying primarily on biblical narratives and lists, augmented by exceptional epigraphic finds such as the Moabite stone and the Siloam inscription, researchers could only guess at the way or ways in which the biblical landscape changed from period to period. Lacking independent chronological controls, it was impossible for the researchers to date the artifacts being recovered by their survey and excavation efforts. Thus, descriptions of the material culture of the different periods of biblical history continued to be left largely to the imagination of individual investigators. This serious deficiency was to be remedied in the next century as researchers began to grasp the significance of the region's many tells. Originally, researchers had assumed that tells were part of the region's natural landscape. Certainly this was the view of Robinson, as his comments regarding the imposing site of Tel el-Hesi demonstrate. The form of the tell is singular, a truncated cone with a fine plane on the top. From the information of our guides, and from the remarkable appearance of this isolated tell, we'd expected to find here traces of ruins, and a finer position for a fortress or fortified city could hardly be imagined. Yet we could discover nothing whatever to mark the existence of any former town or structure. There was nothing indeed but the level circular plain which seemed never to have been occupied. As the 19th century progressed, however, researchers began to suspect that these striking topographic features were of human construction. Nevertheless, most investigators, like Warren at Jericho, did not immediately make the necessary connection between the region's tells and its ancient cities. While the identification of Middle Eastern tells with ancient cities was made most dramatically by Schliemann's excavations at Hissarlik, the French epigrapher Charles Clermont-Ganneau reached a similar conclusion on the basis of his analysis of the location of ancient bilingual inscriptions marking the boundary for the ancient city of Gezer. The discovery that the region's tells were the remains of ancient cities was to change forever the way researchers were to understand the archaeological record, and paved the way for the creation of the next great archaeological paradigm.